Hello, everyone. I'm Cassie McLean. I'm the Regional Community Coordinator for the North Central region for Wisconsin Literacy. And welcome to the session, The Little Book of Boards, a conversation with author Erik Henberg, sponsored by Wisconsin Literacy. Wisconsin Literacy is a nonprofit statewide coalition of 70 literacy agencies. We strengthen literacy through professional development opportunities, personalized consultations, health literacy, workforce connections, networking, and advocacy. I'm pleased to introduce Erik Henberg. Erik has spent nearly 20 years working with nonprofits. In addition to serving as the director of 2 nonprofits, he has served as an interim executive director twice and worked for nonprofits in marketing and fundraising. He has also served on boards and committees for more than a dozen organizations, often in leadership roles, and several times during a capital campaign. He's the author of 4 books for nonprofits, focusing on nonprofit management, fundraising, social media, and board governance, which have collectively sold tens of thousands of copies. They've been praised as essential reads for nonprofits by Forbes.com, LinkedIn for Nonprofits, Kirkus Reviews, and thousands of executive directors and board members. And for those of you that are members of Wisconsin Literacy, you received a copy of the Little Book of Boards to read prior to the session. And with that, Erik, welcome.
Thank you so much. Am I coming through loud and clear?
You are coming through loud and clear.
Okay, good deal. Well, I really appreciate this chance to speak to you, and thank you for the introduction. I'm excited to talk about these topics with this group. I love boards, I love nonprofits, I love Wisconsin. I work in literacy as an author, so it ticks all the boxes. I want to spend this time talking about nonprofit boards and how they work, how they don't, how we might improve them, and how best to show up.
Excuse me, Erik, I forgot to mention, if you do have questions that come up, please just put them in the chat and we will make sure that Erik gets them. I'm sorry, Erik.
No, I appreciate that. We talked before the call about how some of the folks at nonprofit literacy or at Wisconsin Literacy will read some of those questions to me at different times throughout. So we've got that handled. Please feel free to put them in the chat. I want to be as helpful as possible. As we said, I've been the director of a couple nonprofits, interim director, and I will highlight that many of those have been at small and very small nonprofits. That's been the focus of my publishing and my writing. One of them, the Grand Cinema, I think by the time I was done, I built it up to about 12. City Club of Tacoma I was the director of. That was just 2 of us, and for a while, just me. So I've been in those roles. The Tahoma Audubon Society, our local chapter here, was, I think, 3 when I was the interim. And then the other one was a youth focused nonprofit, and that was 4, something like that. So I intuitively get how these small nonprofits work. I've also had positions at much larger nonprofits, public radio, a Catholic high school, in development and marketing. And then you put in all of those different boards and committees, sometimes, again, very small organizations with a part-time person in one case. And then I was 12 years in elected office, which is kind of like a nonprofit board in many ways, but we were a $40 million government agency. So it really is the gamut, which I'm bringing here. These are those 4 books where I've tried to capture that and support especially those small and very small nonprofits who are doing the work, who are on the ground, sleeves rolled up. That's where my passion is, and so that's where I've really focused. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. I want to just do start with a quick high gloss on like, why do nonprofit boards exist? What's our role in general? And then let's dive deep on what some of those key responsibilities are of boards and ways to really leverage the work that that board is doing to improve the nonprofit and your mission. I also, as part of this, we had questions that people could submit. And I think half of them in some ways were about recruiting. So I built a section of this presentation to really dive deep into recruiting. And that's recruiting for new board members. We will have an opportunity to do questions at the end, but also some strategic times throughout as well. So with that in mind, let's get going. Why do nonprofit boards exist? And I think that in some ways, or let's not even talk about why do nonprofit boards exist. Let's talk about like, why do nonprofits exist? And I actually have what I jokingly refer to as my grand unifying theory of nonprofits. Nonprofits exist to keep a good idea alive, even after the original founder has stepped away. Because not everything needs to be a nonprofit. If you want to bring books to the local school and you want to have a book drive and you want to figure out how to get more and more books into that school, that doesn't necessarily have to be a nonprofit. You can just do it. And I think sometimes we get caught up in the whole nonprofit thing. You can just do it. But the key thing is that if it's a good idea, if it's something that other people want to support, if they want to give money to, and if you want it to continue, even after you, the founder of this good idea, have, kind of burnt out a little bit on it, a nonprofit is a structure that helps take that really good idea into the future. The US likes nonprofits and has written it into the tax code, where we say they are good for society and they have a special status. Churches, museums, schools, childcare, I think you understand how that part of it works. But each of them have particular reason why it exists. And that is actually, again, written into the taxes. When you file taxes as a nonprofit, you have to report, why do you exist? It's an unusual thing, and it's a really important one, that mission. So given that, let's talk about why the nonprofit boards exist. And I really think of them as being representatives of the broader community who are coming and saying, we are going to steward this good idea, and we are going to represent the community to make sure that it's happening. Nonprofits can't have owners. They can't have people who are, drawing the money out of it. It's part of the way it's written. And in that case, the board is the one who acts as the owner during those times where they are representing to the community what's happening. And this comes back to the mission. The board is fundamentally, making sure that the nonprofit says what it's going to do. We are here to bring books to this school district, and the board is there to make sure that those literacy goals are being met. The mission. One of the questions that we had coming to this was just, what is out there besides what we think of as like a traditional 501c3 nonprofit or board? A 501c3, if you haven't heard that phrase before, that just refers to the line in the tax code that defines how nonprofits work. So if you hear that, that's what that's referring to. And there are alternatives to what we think about in terms of this traditional nonprofit. So one of the ones that I think is actually pretty interesting is some organizations start as like being a fiscal sponsor of a larger nonprofit. So this is also called like having an umbrella nonprofit. Sometimes you want to find out if this idea is a good idea and you don't want to go through all of the legal hoops to form a nonprofit. And so you find a larger organization and you are part of them, and they take maybe 4 or 5% of anything that you earn in exchange for the bookkeeping and some of the legal side of it. But it gives you that tax umbrella where you can accept donations and you can exist. You can get started very quickly without having that traditional board. At some point you might say, hey, we're ready to graduate. We're ready to become our own thing. We'll become our own 501c3. The nice thing about it is at some point you might say, this didn't really work the way we thought. And you can just wrap it up without, again, all of the legal things that would happen if you're winding down a nonprofit. So fiscal sponsorships, I'm seeing more and more people use, and there's a lot of online resources about that. There's also those interesting ideas of, like, depending on which state you're in, a B Corp or a social purpose corporation. These are things that are kind of in between for-profit and nonprofit. They are for-profit in that they might have an owner, maybe, again, it differs by state, but they also are for some sort of good. And you have to, just like a nonprofit, you have to declare what that good is. You also might find other nonprofit tax structures like 501c4s or 5s or 6s. And those are designated for economic development, lobbying, homeowners associations. So there's other kinds out there as well, just so you know. And you probably don't need to get into those because you probably are a traditional nonprofit, but I just wanted to flag them. And then again, as I mentioned, sometimes you don't need to be a nonprofit. Sometimes you can just do the work. And that is another alternative to being that traditional structure. So with that quick overview, I really want to dig into what does it mean to be on a board? What does that service entail? And we're going to start with just simply, what does a board do? And in my experience, a lot of boards, I don't want to critique a board who does this because it's very natural. A lot of boards are drawn to something because they love the mission so much that they want to do it. And so they want to be involved in all of the decisions of the nonprofit. And what they end up doing is repeating a lot of the work that a director might do, and getting really into some of the weeds of the operations. The director brings them, here's our next brochure, and a group of people critique it and wordsmith it together. If you really think about the time that takes, how many hours go into that, it's not a great use of everyone's time. I have as one of my goals to separate some of that work. What is the work of the board and what is the work of the operations? So here's what, in my opinion, and what I think a lot of others feel a board should be doing. And it really starts with the mission. This gets to what I just talked about. A good board ensures the nonprofit is following its mission. And I joke that is like a board member of the symphony checking to see if the symphony actually performs symphonies. And it's not quite that simple, because most likely your mission has some really big words in it about your aspirations and your goals and your visions for what you want to see. How are you doing in those regards? A board member or a board at all that's really pushing someone, we're not just here for literacy, we're here to inspire a lifelong love of learning. How is the nonprofit doing that? Those are really great questions for boards to ask for. And that's something that you can do internally at board meetings with your director, but that's also something that a board member should be doing externally. Posting on Facebook about how much they love the nonprofit that they serve on the board of. Really, trying to go out and bang the drums for this organization. That's when requested. I will say that sometimes board members can go a little rogue sometimes on that. If someone asks you to, please, step up and do it. These are great things that a board could be doing, and it all comes back to that one goal, the mission. A board also should be setting policy. And a policy can mean a lot of different kinds of things. So policy, in this case, might mean an employee handbook could be considered a form of policy that's approved by a board. A policy might mean, about how you do your work. Like we have a whistleblower policy. We have policies on volunteer background checks. These are some of the things that boards can do to quote unquote, set guardrails for the organization. Like, this is how we want to do our work. We know that our work is something to do with literacy, here's how we're going to go about it. Here's our policy on partnerships, so that we form partnerships with organizations that share our common values, one I've seen before. This is something that boards sometimes forget about, and they just handle things as they come up. But when things come up routinely, a board member might say, hey, should we just set a policy about this so that our executive director can just go forth and do it within these guardrails? It's a really useful thing. I also really want to emphasize that a board oversees the budget and the finances. And actually, there's a really good reason for this, because board members are, if you don't know, legally and fiscally liable for the nonprofit. That's one of those responsibilities that not every nonprofit board member learns unless it's too late. I had that experience. I was 23. My parents had modeled board service to me as something that they were on the school, my local school board, things like that. And when I was invited to join this board of, we put on the New Year's Eve event every year, I was honored. I thought I've arrived, I'm part of the community. And I joined this board, and we kept hearing about this grant, and we had this grant, but the money hadn't arrived, New Year's Eve came and went. The artists and bands and everyone wanted to get paid. The money hadn't arrived. And finally, someone said, I don't think it's arriving, which I still to this day don't know if that was the grantor or the staff. But that's when I learned, when the board president said, as board members, we are liable. And that was my introduction to board service, which tells you how great I do think board service is in general, if I could get past that shock to the system. I will also note here, boards can protect themselves with something called D&O insurance, which is short for director and it's officers or operations. I think it's director and officers insurance. I was just called it D&O, and I forget what the O stands for. It's actually not that much, and it protects a board from this kind of a thing. And if you take something from this call, I hope you will investigate that at your organization. Budget and finances is such an important part of where a board falls. I would ask, if you are on a board right now, to look at the profit and loss sheet the next time that you get it. And if you don't understand exactly what it is trying to tell you, ask a question, raise a hand. In my experience, if you are confused, there's probably someone else who's confused. A treasurer or the board president or the director can walk you through some of these things and help you understand them. If you don't know, it doesn't have to be at a meeting, it could be something separate. But just understanding the gist of it. I'm not saying you have to know what every single number means at every single meeting. Things change, things pop up. But when someone puts that in front of you, or the balance sheet, it's good to understand what that is. And it's good to think about the budget that informs that. Many nonprofits, especially small nonprofits, don't use budgets. The board approves every $500 purchase as it happens, every $40 purchase. And it's a really actually an efficient way for everyone's time to handle finances. If you can project forward and say, what do we think we will make and spend this year? It's a really powerful tool for growth, for planning. And I would encourage, if you don't have a budget, to really spend some time. I do have some templates for budgets that I'm happy to send to the Wisconsin literacy folks, so you can just send me an email. It's at the end of this presentation, and ask for it. But having that as a tool, it's one of those things that if you don't have it, even just that takes you to the next level. So we've just covered 3 different things: mission, policy, finance. And what I would let you know, I'm pausing here, is that every nonprofit board of every size, whether you are a $3 billion nonprofit hospital, or whether you are a small literacy nonprofit with only 1 staff member or no staff members, These three things affect everyone. Every board of a 501c3 is thinking about these three things at some point. It's just across the board part of the job. But there's more, and sometimes this affects some folks and sometimes it doesn't. One of those things is this is the phrase that you often hear: a board hires and fires the executive director. But we really only use this because it rhymes, I'm convinced. What we really mean by it is that we hire as a board, we supervise, we evaluate, and sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, terminates the executive director. That's what a board does. And it's an unusual working relationship. The board are all volunteers. You have a paid staff member. That's an unusual relationship. A board member is kind of your boss, but kind of not. Only collectively is that board member truly your boss. But sometimes board members think that they are the like, I'm your boss. It's an unusual relationship, and I think that some clarity around that can really be helpful. And it's also, here's another phrase that I really like. A board has an employee of just one, their executive director, sometimes two. Some theaters, for example, have like an artistic director and a managing director or something like that. But in general, boards have an employee of one. And that creates what I think of as an hourglass form, where you have the board on the top, and then it comes to a point where the executive director serves the board, and then the staff reports to the executive director. And I really want to emphasize this because it's one of those things that I think gives clarity to everyone's role here. The board, what should probably be at the other tip of this point of the board's triangle is the board president. The board working through the board president or an executive committee, that's how they should really, quote, supervise the executive director. No individual board member can assign work to the ED. Maybe a committee can request something, or the executive committee or the board president, but you can't just have every single board member saying, hey, would you write a report on this? And hey, would you do this? It doesn't work. So funneling all of that through some of those committees or the leadership is really important. And you don't want to go around the executive director. There's a reason it comes to a point here, and start trying to talk to the rest of the staff. That is a recipe to make a staff member really confused about who their boss is. And it's also going to really upset the director when they think that their staff member is doing one thing, but oh, a board member called and asked them to do something else. That doesn't work. So I do have some tips around this. If you're a board member working with a staff member, get to know them, have coffee, have a phone call, have breakfast or dinner, just get to know them a little bit, find out what they're thinking about, what they're working on, so that you have that relationship. So much of the work we do in nonprofits is relational. That relationship helps. And don't try to go around them. Don't try to direct staff. It's not a game you want to be playing in. It's just going to lead to a lot of hard feelings and a lot of inefficiencies. I also think it's important to remember that I'm not saying you have to agree with the executive director every time, that your job is to just, say whatever they think. Like, you should be willing to say what you think and argue for it. You are there in many ways for that role, to talk about, how could we be doing this? And that's part of what you're there for. And this is from my own personal experience. I always encourage board members, don't monopolize the time of the ED outside of meetings. I have had, board members texting me at 10:30 at night. When I was the director, I've had long phone calls, and some of that is part of the job and some of it is unnecessary. And I really do think that board members who, if you're about to call the executive director thinking, what would it be like if everyone did this, would be a useful for the director. I always think it's worth trying to get people back into the systems. Come to the committee meetings, come to the board meetings, the one-on-one things that happen where people are, regularly calling and venting kvetching, that's what can really drain a lot of the time away from a director. I would also finally encourage those board members not to hold grudges when something doesn't go their way. The executive director is there; they're your paid expert, and you don't have to always get along to still have that shared vision, or you don't always have to get your way to have your shared vision. I hope you still do get along. Not every nonprofit has that staff. This is one of those times where, as I mentioned, this is not something that everyone has. And so it's worth just, if this applies to you, here's some quick notes that I might have. In those meetings that you have, it's sometimes hard to balance how you do the work versus being that nonprofit board, that what I've talked about. I think it's worth just being clear about it. We're doing our governance job now, and now we're doing our operations part. You could alternate meetings, you could just split the meeting in half, something like that. You're kind of doing all sorts of, putting a foot in both squares. But it's worth thinking about so that as you grow, you can be clear about like what our roles are. I also think it is worth deputizing as much as possible those committees and small groups for some work. And we'll talk about committees in a little bit. But it's a really effective way to work, to have small groups doing something as opposed to larger board. And you can be a little bit, you can do more things if you have those small groups working together. And I do think small nonprofits without an executive director really benefit from having good technology and a good understanding of systems. How are you communicating with each other? These are the kinds of things that can really supercharge a small group if you can get everyone onto the same page. Here's how we communicate, here's how we work together while you are going about the work. This is something, not everyone can do this, but sometimes you can start planning for growth by having a volunteer executive director. It could just be a board member who says, okay, I'm no longer the board member, I'm your volunteer executive director, and it's a change of roles. But it's good practice. It's a good way to start some of this work and to start planning for what might be a part-time, quarter time even. I was briefly at City Club of Tacoma because it was the depths of the Great Recession, briefly quarter time before I was able to build the position up into more full work. And so you can find ways to find people who are very part-time as you're growing. And there's lots of people who are interested in that work, people who are returning to the workforce after their kids go to school, people who would otherwise retire but are interested in keep still doing some work. There's lots of different ways that you can find someone. A young person who just really wants to dive in and build their skills. So those are the kinds of things that if you can start moving in that direction, that's what would help get you out of that system of just having or working without an ED. And I will flag, I think that there are some executive directors here. You do have a role in some of this as well, and how you can support a board doing some of these things. I think about it as like working to keep the train on the tracks, keeping the system moving, keeping the board members where they're supposed to be, bringing together the committee if you need to. If the committee chair isn't remembering to schedule the meetings, can you help? It's a really useful thing to keep those things moving. I also think an executive director can take on tasks. It's easy to say, oh, that's the board's job, that's the board's job. But if there's a task that you can do that enables the board to do better at their side of things, I think that that's really important. When I was at City Club, we would have a membership, like a membership drive. And I would handle printing all of the call sheets. Here's your call sheet, here's the person you're calling, here's reminding them for the membership or thanking them for their membership, whatever it is. I handled all of that part. And then I got the board together, and then 10 people in a room were calling people based on their call sheets. Way more work than what I could have done on my own. I created, as I think about it, the bucket to allow them to do the great work that they were able to do. So tasks I think are something that executive directors can really help with, while boards are often great for some of the decisions and when you need a lot of people, a lot of relationship things. I also think executive directors can be useful for helping to frame a decision, to frame, we can go this way or we can go this way. A lot of this is in an executive director's mind. They understand the pull between mission and budget, and how we can figure these things out. They can bring this to the board and they can say, we can go really deep and serve this middle school really well, or we can go really broad and serve this entire school district. Let's have this conversation. That provides the frame that lets a board dig in, based on the experience of the director. And they can also provide their own expertise. As I said, the executive director's been doing the work. They are paid. They should probably know more about this than any individual board member. They should have a say. They should have their thumb on the scale a little bit, given that example of, one middle school versus the entire school district. I would, as a board member, want to know what the executive director thinks. And they should be willing to share as well. While again, also understanding that we're all here for the same thing. The board might disagree, but share. Everyone should be willing to. And that gets to, what I was talking about again, nudging the board in the right direction, helping them with your own expertise, your own experience, to think about how you might want to see this happen. You can nudge in subtler ways. If there's divisions on the board, you might say, well, I think we could really use a board retreat, and we'll dive into some of those issues. And then you work to find a facilitator and when you're building the agenda, you might make sure that there's time for a topic that you think is important. That's a way to help the board, see things that maybe they need to see, without you being the scold, the one who is managing up. It's difficult as a director to get too far into board business, because when it really comes down to it, they're on the board and you work for them, and if you're telling them that they're doing it wrong, that's not always well received. But you can find ways to use your influence to start getting the board where you maybe think they should be. I'm going to keep going here. That was an extended digression from hiring and firing the executive director, but I think it was the right place for it. A board plans. And I want to emphasize this because it's one of those things that these days, after these last few years, it feels like, well, who can plan for anything? Who knows what's going to happen? But I still think that the work is important. I still think that, popping your head up and looking down the horizon 3 years is a useful thing. What is changing in our world? What is changing in our community? Are funding streams changing? How are people going about the work? Are we called to adjust our work a little bit? This is really where boards can shine, because having a group of people do this work is almost always better than having one person do this work. You might rely on your executive director, your board president, for the arrow on the compass, but some of the fine tuning of it really needs the rest of the board to check for blind spots, check for biases. Is this truly what our community wants? That's why we have all of these stewards of the community here in the room to help us figure that out. I think it's one of those things that is underused from a board, and it's always, every time that the process itself is sometimes as valuable as the plan that comes from it. A good board fundraises. And this is one of those things where I say that and it's like, oh no, what does that mean? What are you signing me up to do? For a small nonprofit, it might not be that much. I think that a board member might volunteer to do 2 different fundraising activities a year. That might mean stuffing envelopes during an annual appeal. That might mean being, working a fundraising event as a greeter or something like that. Supporting the nonprofit. You don't necessarily have to go out and ask for money. And in fact, if you haven't had any training in that regard, I would not encourage a board member to do it. But you might connect your friends and your coworkers to the organization. That's a form of fundraising, especially if it's tied to like a fundraising event. If you have a breakfast event, boards are really good at filling tables. We had this fundraiser. They go to their friends, they go to their family, they go to their coworkers. Hey, would you come and support this? It's a really good organization, and I hope you'll come. That person comes, maybe they donate $50 and then they leave and they're never heard from again, and that's fine. But sometimes they can really come and they're like, wow, I had no idea that this organization existed. I had no idea that this good work is happening. And then, what they thought was going to be a $50 donation is now 200, and they're on your mailing list and they want to give again at the end of the year and get more involved. So a good board, because again, they have however many people are on your board. If each of them fills a table at this hypothetical event, that's a lot of potential people who are being introduced to the nonprofit, not just as donors, which is great, but also just, hey, come hear about the good work that we're doing. That's a really great use for a board. They bring them into the sphere of the ED or the board president, and help grow that nonprofit even bigger. And finally, I think that a good board improves itself. And when I think about that, what I mean is two different things. One of them is gets better at its skills, like what we're doing right now. What does it mean to be a board member? Sometimes boards can say, we need fundraising training. We need diversity, equity, and inclusion training. We need training on, I once had a board that had recently just had like public speaking training. Boards can improve, boards can get better, and those things stick around. They can improve their systems, they can improve their culture. Board development committees or governance committees are the kind of thing that can help do that, lead that transition. The other way that a board can improve itself is by finding new board members, better board members, I say hesitantly, people with more experience, people with more background in the work. A board should over time, get a little bit better as people start to as the organization grows. New board members should emerge who maybe wouldn't have thought of being on that board otherwise. That's nothing about the current nonprofit board, but it is true. Hopefully, the quality of the board members in terms of their experience and their background and really starts to elevate, and you see it as nonprofits grow. That brings us to here are the main things: the mission, policy, budget and finances, hiring and firing, although as I said, it's only because it rhymes. Planning, overseas budget and finances. I think that one was fundraisers. I messed that up. And improves itself. That is our core responsibilities of a board. And I think it's worth just phrasing, lingering on what isn't on that list. It is telling the executive director what to do. If you have an executive director, you are not dictating, here's what you're doing. You're not reviewing the brochure, to use that. They're leading the operations. You've given them guardrails in the form of policy. You've given them a budget, which is in many ways an operational document, but that's about as close as you're going to get. There was a theater in Tacoma, this is about 15, 16 years ago, that closed. And when they closed, there was a board member who was quoted in the newspaper. She just joined the board several months, a few months before they closed. And she said, I thought we got to pick the place. And to me, that was a heartbreaking story, because it's not her fault. No one told her that that's not what a board does, especially for a board that was going through like significant financial issues. People are drawn to the theater because they like the plays, and you can understand how they might think we get to pick the plays. But that's not where the board really falls. That's why you have, hopefully, some staff to lead that for you. I want to talk about like how a board might go about some of this work, because sometimes it can feel like a lot. And here's some different ways that I think it's worth thinking about. I think that it's worth thinking about that this is all about the group. In general, I try to avoid having board members go out and do things on their own. It's not as much fun. Someone who wants to be on a board probably wants to work in a group anyway, and it's more likely to get done when it's in a group format. You get a lot of people together with a shared vision for something that is described by the mission. Let's bring their collective wisdom together. Let's get their ideas about something. Let's hear what they have to say. Those are useful things. There are risks to this. The two that I've seen most often is that, you know, like a group think where a board, for whatever reason, gets locked into where they're not hearing outside feedback. They're really insular. Usually that's a result of, you know, frankly, some false choices that they've been making, or like one powerful board member who always gets their way, and so the board feels like, well, they have to do that, and then they have a hard time doing something else. But those are pretty rare, I think. In my experience, it's worth acknowledging that there are power dynamics, but I don't think it's a huge thing. Boards work in groups, in meetings. This is a phrase that comes from the military. Actually, I think it's the Navy SEALs, but it might be broader than that. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And this really resonates with me because the pace that boards move at, and for example, we'll talk about recruiting in a little while, and someone might look at it and say, I can't believe that you want to start 6 months before the end of the fiscal year. But if you move slow, you're actually can move pretty smoothly, and smooth is actually pretty fast. When you're hurrying, when you're rushing, it often takes more time. It doesn't feel like it, but it does. But the pace that a board moves at, you can often, if you just go at a smooth pace for a year, you will be amazed what you got done in a year. Where sometimes that feeling of like, we have to do it now, we have to do it now, you can end up just running in place. This is, I think, a quote from Cervantes. I love quotes. I love reading. Again, I'm in the right room. Character may be manifested in the great moments, but it is made in the small ones. And that really strikes me because it's not just true for your personal character, but it's true for boards as well. There are times where a board will practice. I think about it as like muscle memory. You do the work of going through the agenda. You do the work of, you know, well, what are we supposed to be doing? And you go through, you know, 2 years where it feels like, why are we doing this? You know, hopefully you don't go through 2 years feeling like, why are we doing this? But you go through 2 years of just like everything being normal, and you're spending that time in some ways rehearsing. It's like, you know, here's how we operate. Here's how we set our agenda. Here's how we do all of these things. And then when a crisis happens, when suddenly there's a shock to the system, a budgetary thing, an executive director leaving, or whatever it is, all of that work that you've been doing, that is a form of muscle memory that will help you make sure that you know how to tackle this big scary thing when it shows up, in those great moments. Turning crisis into opportunity takes the practice in the normal day-to-day work. I also am going to take a moment here to say that boards work when they use committees really well. I love committees. It is a weird quirk of mine that I think committees are great. And I want to spend just a second here talking about how a board can leverage its committees in order to really get the most out of them. There's two different kinds of committees in my experience. You have like a standing committee, and it's called a standing committee because it stands on the calendar the fourth Thursday at noon or the third Wednesday at 4 o'clock, whatever it is. They stand on the calendar. You also have committees that show up, you know, a nominations committee that meets for the last 4 months of the year. Or you have a task force. We're going to evaluate our technology and see what we need to be doing. And they only meet twice and then never again. So those are some of the board committees that you might see. These are common standing committees of a nonprofit: finance, governance, program, development. There's others, but these are some of the most common that I see. And some of them sometimes have different names. Governance might be board development or things like that. Most boards, in my experience, if you look at your board size and you say, okay, how many committees could we fill of 3 people? That's probably about how many committees you could fill. If you have 9, you could probably have 3 committees, and everyone would serve on 1 committee and get a lot done. You know, think about what some of these things are that really need to be your focus. Finance is great. I always encourage treasurers to start a finance committee if they don't have one. If for no other reason than when it's time for you to be done treasurer, there's some likely people who can step in afterward. I think that having like a governance or a board development committee is really great. If every year you got a couple new policies done, here's our conflict of interest policy, or they're the ones who lead the annual retreat, or whatever it is, having that kind of a committee that's there to improve and develop the board is really great. They can also lead the nominations process for new board members. Again, we'll talk about that in a second. Program is one where I think some directors get a little, I'm not sure I want a program committee, because it can get into operations sometimes a little bit too strongly, unless you focus it on, you know, like looking at metrics. How are we doing serving very high level? Maybe considering other opportunities that are out there can be useful in that kind of a way. And a development committee. Again, one that sometimes has a good reason to be there, sometimes can get a little too easy to just delegate and say, well, they're the fundraisers now. But it's nice to have someone who's thinking about the annual event, or thinking about support. How can we support the executive director with the appeal at the end of the year? Maybe you're going to do a phone-a-thon, and that would be the committee that helps organize the board to do it. Something like that. I want to flag that committees are also a really good proving ground for non-board members. You don't have to just have board members on your committee. Having a few non-board members is a nice balance, and again, get some outside views. And committees can really be where you roll up your sleeves, you do the work. It's a lot easier there than it is at the big board meeting. If you have 9 people on your board, it's way easier to do work in a group of 3 than it is in a group of 9. And again, I think executive directors in general should quote staff these committees. They can be the one to make sure that the program committee isn't going this way while development's going this way. It's also a really good opportunity to spend face time with your bosses. It's where a lot of that work can happen. And since there is a work focus, I think it's a good place for the ED to be supporting those groups. I do have an example here of how I think about boards and committees working. And I hope this is a little, I hope this is revealing in terms of how this could happen. So let's say that the board governance committee had a change. We're going to implement terms. Maybe your board didn't have terms up until this point. So we're going to have terms, and they bring that to the board and they say, we're recommending terms. And they get all this feedback. Like, oh, well, does this mean term limits? And is 3 years right? Or should we do, 2 years renewable? And how, all these questions. Lots of discussion. They take that back to the committee and they say, wow, there was a lot of feedback on that. And they look at it and they think, well, what should we take? And how much of this feels right to us? So they come back at the next meeting and they say, we appreciate everything that you said. And here's our recommendation for the policy. And in my experience, that'll pass in about 5 minutes because people feel heard. People feel like, oh yeah, like they heard what I had to say. Maybe they didn't take everything, but they went away and they met and they came back. This takes something, and if you'll notice, the model is the committee does the work, and then they bring it forward, they take it away again, and then they come back for passage. And it's a cultural habit that I think is really useful for boards to get into. See the board, see the budget in November, pass it in December. See a policy proposal in March, pass it in April, something like that. It takes pressure off, because what can often happen, this is an alternative, we're going to propose term limit or terms, let's say, and then we bring that to the board. There's all of that same feedback, but if they're trying to pass it right there, what ends up happening is discussion goes long because everyone thinks that we have to pass it. People start taking sides. In my experience, the longer a single discussion goes, the more likely you are to start having a split. Sometimes that's based on personality. Sometimes that's just based on, legitimate disagreements and like a policy discussion or something like that. And then people start trying to fix it on the fly. Oh, well, what if we said this? And what if we changed this to this? And what if we made this change? They're trying to wordsmith. And then they're just trying to get something passed so that they can move on to the next thing. Sometimes you even end up with like a split vote in this situation where someone digs their heels in. So this is what I'm trying to fight against when I say that committees can be the workhorses. Let the committee do the work and only come back to the board when you have something that you're ready to do. The downside of this structure is that when you get back to the governance committee, they come together and they meet and they're feeling shell-shocked. They're like, that did not go how we wanted it to. And what was the point of us doing all that work anyway if they're just going to change it? That's especially true if there's like a non-board member on that committee. That's a committee that feels less empowered, that didn't do that isn't the workhorse because it was all just revised later anyway. It's that minor thing. Again, the committee does the work, the board sees it, sends it back, and then brings it back again for a final vote. It actually takes less time and it keeps the board humming along. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. We will be talking about recruiting next. Again, I had a lot of questions about recruiting, but I did want to just take a moment to ask our folks at Wisconsin Literacy, were there any questions that came up there in the chat that you think we should address right now before we move on?
No, nothing in the chat other than agreement on some of the points that you've made. So I think you could move right along.
Okay. Thank you so much. I am going to lead into recruiting here. And I think this is one of those topics that, again, can stymie a board. I have sat in those board meetings where we're just sitting around and we're like, well, what about this person? Well, what about this person? It's like, isn't there some way that we could do this a little bit more focused? And so here's my recommendation for board recruiting. And just so you know, I can send this slide deck to Wisconsin Literacy, and you can also email me for it as well. So if you can take notes, or you can just ask me for the slides. It's a process, and I really think that it's starts with a committee, as you might guess after that last bit about how much I love committees. Having a committee lead this process is going to just be way faster than having the board try to tackle it as a board. So this might be the governance committee or board development committee. If you don't have one, maybe this is the way to get it rolling. The executive committee of the board can do this. I realize now that I haven't actually used that phrase. If you don't know, the executive committee are the officers of the board: the treasurer, the president, the vice president, if you have one, the secretary. Sometimes past president is included in the executive committee, depending on the nonprofit. Executive committees can lead this process as well. And you can also have just like a special stand-up nominations committee. Some nonprofits do this every year. A committee forms, they go through the nominations, and then they go away, and that's their sole purpose. A small group to do the work, though, again, I will emphasize, is really important. So here's how I would do it. Let's talk about the first meeting. It's worth looking at the board as it exists right now. What are the skills that we have on the board right now? Do we have people who are financially minded? Do we have people who run businesses? Do we have people who deeply know our subject matter? Do we have people who have expertise in law, marketing, government itself? These are kinds of the things where you can just look at the current board and say, what do we have? What skills do we have? And what are we missing? Something to think about. It's also good in this small group to look at the board's diversity. Sometimes you can ask the board to self-identify about some of these things, but you can often just say, well, we have a lot of folks in their 60s, or we have mostly men, or we have mostly women. You can look at, or we are we serve the county, but everyone comes from the town. Things like that. Think about it in all sorts of different ways. Who's in the room and who's not in the room. You also, it's worth, this committee can look at the bylaws and see if you have terms or term limits. Is there anyone who is up for, like to renew? Some boards have like 2-year terms or 3-year terms, and they're renewable maybe forever, or they're renewable once or twice. If that describes you, you want to know early on in this recruiting process, do we have anyone who is going to have to roll off of the board because their terms, they are term limited out? Or do we have someone who's up for renewal? And is that person going to renew again? Someone should be deputized, either the director or the board president or the chair of the committee, to check in with these folks and say, are you thinking about standing, for another term? That's a really useful thing. That might be just the first meeting, depending on how those evaluations go and how much time you really spend on them. That might be the start. Or you could just also blend right into this next part, which it would be what I think of as the second meeting for board recruiting. Hopefully, you do have the information of how many people are returning or not. And that will tell you how many seats you have to fill. Now, most boards have some flexibility in the number of board members that they can have. There's like a range. So a board of 9 might be able to have anywhere between 6 and 12 or something like that. But most of the time, organizations try to keep like roughly the same number of people, or if they feel like they're a little small, they'll maybe try to grow by adding a couple seats. The goal would be to really identify like how many people do we need. We have 2 people leaving, 1 board member is renewing again, and we want to grow, so we want to add 1 more. That means that we need 3 people, something like that. It's time to start brainstorming. And this is where having an executive director, or your even if your paid staff member is not an executive director with a different title, they might be helpful in this conversation, because they know probably a lot of people who are connected where board members may not. But here's some of the things, and the board president as well, because they also maybe have been calling donors to thank them. They see the people who come and shake their hand after an event, having them in the room, or a president-elect. Sometimes if you know who's going to be president next year, sometimes they want to participate in this because they can help build the board that they're going to soon lead. So here's some of the things to think about. Do you have any committee members who are not board members? That's one of the first pools to look at. That's someone who has clearly expressed some interest because they serve on the committee. Would any of them be willing to step up to the board? Looking at not just your top donors, but engaged donors. Who seems to really love your organization? Again, this is where a staff member probably will have a good sense, even more than a board member. Who are the people who are really motivated? Yes, it's nice to look for the folks at the top of the donor list, but it doesn't always have to be. Who loves us and gives us money? Those are another short list of people to go to. It's also worth thinking about some of the volunteers who you might have already serving, if you have people who are mentors to youth, if you have people who support in some other way, those are always candidates for board seats as well. They might not be giving, but they're showing that they love your organization through their gift of time. It's also worth thinking about what partner organizations you work with that might have people in them who would be interested, who you work with. They haven't worked with you, in a volunteer or donor capacity, but if you have a partnership with the local library, if you have a partnership, even with like a business, I'm working with a nonprofit right now where one of the new board members is coming from one of the businesses that has long been partnering with the nonprofit. So partner organizations, businesses, governments, sometimes even can help you find new board members in another pool there if you start looking for that. And you might also find community leaders in general who are passionate about your work. And this could be an elected leader. It could just be, a dedicated community leader who seems to serve on a lot of different boards. These kinds of folks can sometimes be drawn into your orbit. One of the things that I will flag that we often don't think about is that the people you serve or served in the past can also be really good candidates for the board. And this depends on how long, it might depend in your case on how long you've been around, especially if you're working with youth literacy or something like that. But if there are people who have benefited from your nonprofit, that's a really great person to consider for the board if you can, find them later. Sometimes you hear these stories. Someone sends an email and says, hey, I don't know if you know this, but you were so meaningful. Here's my life story since working with you. Thank you for all that you did. That's someone you want to get to know for a variety of reasons, not just because they're a possible board member, but what a great story, but also could be someone to think about. I think about the example of, if there are people, a homeless shelter really does well to have someone who has experienced homelessness on their board, for example. So this is the kind of thing that it's an untapped resource that not every nonprofit thinks about. So inevitably in this conversation, you will hopefully come up with some names. And hopefully the goal is like twice the number of names that you need. You might end up with more names, that's fine. But, oh yeah, this person would be good, or oh yeah, that person would be good. Getting them onto this kind of a short list would be really useful. And then I want you to really think about like, who has the relationship? And this is also how the long list becomes the short list. Who has a relationship to approach these people? Is it the board president? Is it the executive director? Is it just a board member who's a friend with them? And they're not even in the room, but you say, oh yeah, Dennis has a great relationship with them. Maybe we should ask him to approach them. Map that out. And I think that's the next way to approach this. Figure out the relationships so that you don't just have a cold ask. Because what I mentioned, the long list turning into the short list, inevitably you come up with some names of people who you don't have a relationship with. You're like, wouldn't it be great to get this community leader onto our board? And everyone says, yes, we would love that. Who knows, who knows her? And then there's crickets. It's like, well, now what do we do? And what I would recommend is then it's a target for the nonprofit for the next year to find some of these people and look for ways to bring them closer. A personal invitation to an event. The executive director emails that person and says, I'd love to invite you out for coffee or give you a tour or, whatever it is. Like these kinds of things where it's just like, you're just going to cultivate a relationship for the next year can really help. You don't always get these people to get a little bit closer, but if they are interested in the work that you do, you can spend that time and they might make a great candidate for next year. That's one of the things that I found is that if you have a process like this, The second year, it's always a little bit easier than the first year because you have the people who popped up the year before who might be really good possibilities for the next year if they didn't get it the first year. So now at this point, we've had a couple meetings. We have a short list of who we want and relationships with them, which means we need to go out and start asking them if they're interested. And those relationships, I think the phrase that comes to mind is, will you stand for nomination? Or would you consider being nominated? Something like that. It's a better phrasing than just like, would you be on the board? First of all, that's a little, can be a little aggressive. But would you stand for nomination gives a little bit of a way to approach someone without having to double check with everyone. This is actually where nonprofit boards can really get hung up, is they sit around the room and they say, what about this name? And then they all decide, yes, that would be good. And then someone goes out and asks them. And then they report back and they say, no, they weren't interested. And then they talk about another name and they're like, yes, that person would be good. And they go out and ask. And then they say, no, they wouldn't be interested. And so it really slows things down. Whereas if you say, would you stand for nomination? Just go out and start asking anyone. I joke, but like you can ask anyone at that point. And it gives you the flexibility to back away if needed. It gives you the flexibility to say, I'm sorry, we're full up this year or something like that, because they were just nominated. That's all it was. It's a really nice balance to let anyone on the nonprofit like go out and start, hey, we're looking for board members, while also knowing you have some people who are really targeted by this nominations committee or governance committee or whatever it is, to go out and find the people you really want. And it's really nice. This is something that I see a little bit of thought with, like a nice letter inviting them to stand for nomination, as well as like maybe here's a little bit more about us. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but something like that, where like when you meet with them and like, here's something for you to consider, they're a lot more likely to consider it than if it's just a verbal ask. So consider that as well. Something nice, just a nice little letter, can really help make it more likely that they will say yes. And it's also worth, again, I don't want to rule out that you might get someone simply by putting an open call out for nominations. I think during this process, putting in your newsletter, putting on Facebook, however you communicate, we're considering nominations for the board. If you'd be interested, here's what you should do. It rarely works, but it does a couple things. It lets everyone know that like, hey, this is an open call and not everyone will get it, which is a nice thing. It's not just we're picking these 4 and it's just them. But open calls are really nice. You can also find someone who you never would have thought of before because they self-identify as a possible candidate. And you can encourage board members that they can go out and nominate folks as well, especially if they have a deadline. So this is again, a nice balance between finding the people you want and kind of this open concept where anyone can apply. This is something that I think it's really useful when you tell someone, we want you to be nominated, stand for nomination. They should have to do something. It could be just write us a short paragraph about yourself or about why you want to join the board. Or here's a form, just this a short form, your name, your contact information. Why do you care about the mission of this nonprofit, and tell us a little bit about yourself. That's it. And first of all, it's really nice because not everyone knows everyone who's applying, so you can get to know someone. But this is actually secretly a test. We want to find out if this person is willing to do even the most basic task of filling out a very short form or writing a short paragraph. I have seen where someone says, well, what about this person? And it's like, great. And it's like, they said, yes. Okay, well, can they send us a bio? Oh, no, he's way too busy. We don't want to bother him with that. That's setting it off on the wrong foot. People have sometimes, agreed to be on a board and then ghosted. And I would bet that if you'd asked them to write this, you wouldn't have gotten a response, and you would have learned early on that they probably weren't going to show up anyway. So it's as easy as you can make it, but give them the tiniest hurdle that they have to clear. It also gives you a nice formality, because you then know that this person has actually said yes. Joe, board member over there, says, oh yeah, you know, Dennis is really interested. He says he'll stand for nomination. It's nice to hear it from Dennis directly. So we get this committee for our third, likely final meeting, and we're going to evaluate the names that we've received so far. We need to look at all of these. Do we have enough? You know, ideally we have more than the seats that we need to fill. Not necessarily a lot more, but hopefully we have at least, you know, some options here. And we get to start thinking about, who do we want to take? Who best fits our needs? And if you start comparing people, and this can get a little delicate, so it's worth making sure everyone understands that this is a confidential meeting. No one should be talking about it except for maybe the chair when they report to the rest of the board. So what might you be looking for as you evaluate these folks? Look for people who do love what you do, who have some demonstrated love, either through their volunteer time, their donations, their background, that you can say, yes, this person clearly would align with who we are. It's great to look for people who have more board experience. I mentioned this before about a board, you know, improving itself. Finding people with more board experience than what your average board member currently has is really useful. This can be crass, but let's just put it out there. It's nice to add people who are wealthy to the board, or who know people who are wealthy. That means different things in different places. So I'm not going to linger on what that, on, you know, what wealth is or what rich is or anything like that. But if you can tell that someone is, you know, has some resources, either through an existing donation or what have you, that is worth considering as you're looking to fill some of these seats. Again, I would rather take the love of mission over someone who is wealthy and didn't really care about you. First of all, they probably aren't applying to be on your board, but wealth is a factor to think about. And sometimes you can identify a hole in the board from that first meeting. This is a hole that we have. We don't have someone with this experience, and it's really important to us right now. And this person is bringing some of that experience. And then again, diversity. Board members aren't just, we're not just trying to fill one position, we're trying to think about what the group dynamic is. If you have people, a board that is aging and you haven't found like the next generation to start filtering in, that's a reason to look for youth. If you have where it's more one gender than another, you might look for ways to start balancing that out. So thinking about the effect on the entire board is important as well. And then I'm going to put this out here. Boards often forget to ask about this, but it is a skill that they desperately want. People who can work well in groups. And this is the kind of thing that hopefully over this process, you're getting a sense of. Can someone work well in a group? Are they friendly? Are they kind? Do they know how to advocate for an idea without belittling someone else? Figuring this out can be useful. If you're not sure, sometimes you can bring someone on as like a committee member and say, hey, we'd love to have you on a committee if there's any question about it, and then see how they work in a group. It's a nice way to test someone out. So there are some ways that you can do this. Just again, think about that as you're bringing people onto the board. Hopefully you don't need any jerks. You do have the option. Some boards do this. If they feel like they have a lot of people, they will schedule a fourth meeting for interviews. This really depends. Do you have a lot of names and you can't decide? Do you have a lot of names and no one seems to know anyone in the group? Those might be some reasons to do some interviews. Very likely the names that are mostly familiar to most of the people in this group, you may not need to do that. But that might be why you would do it.
Excuse me, Eric, we do have one question.
Okay.
At what point can or should you consider asking a current or a past learner to be on the board? So someone who's been involved in your literacy program. It feels like it would best represent the people we serve by getting their feedback and direction.
That's a really great question. I would say I wouldn't. I don't know. Are you know, if the learner's a minor, I wouldn't put a minor on the board. I'm not quite sure if that's where where the focus of that particular nonprofit is. I wouldn't put a minor on the board.
This would be adults. It would be
Okay.
adults.
Okay. It can be delicate only in the sense of if there is a lot of reading, which a board often requires a lot of reading, you know, how's that person's skills? That's something to think about a little bit. As I think, you know, I've put out here, board, there's a certain skill to boards. It's not innate, and I would really want to make sure that you have a really good orientation process to get that person so that they feel like they can contribute. So there's some cultural competency that might be required in that as you work with that person. I don't think that there's any reason why you would delay for, you know, like, oh, it should be this many years after they were a learner or anything like that. I don't think that there's anything that suggests that they shouldn't be invited as soon as they are interested and as soon as you're interested. You know, theaters serve their patrons and they bring patrons onto their board. The people who you serve can be on your board. I just think it's worth thinking about some of those kinds of questions. You can, as I mentioned, I think on this last slide about test prospective board members on their ability to work in the group and introduce them to the organization. Could you have 3 board members meet with a group of 3 to 4 learners who you think could be potential candidates? You don't tell them that, yes, but just like, hey, would you give us feedback on how we're doing as a nonprofit? How we're doing serving you? See what kind of responses you get. See how the group dynamics go. Plus, you also get to hear from the people that you serve, so that's a great thing too. And if you end up with that thinking, wow, you know, that was a really helpful session, but she was great, maybe it's time to start thinking about inviting her. So you can do kind of like those little test is the wrong word because it makes it sound like you can fail it, and I hope it doesn't come across like that. But you can just get to know someone in this context, in this a little bit of a more of a professional board setting, and then see what seems like it might be a good fit.
There's one more question in the chat: that does a board usually do a background check on a potential board member?
In my experience, that is rare. I can certainly see the benefits, and I would guess as you get to larger and larger nonprofits, perhaps that's more likely. If you expect your board members at any point to interact with youth, I think that that's usually where you would have something like that, where it's more common. Nonprofits that have any kind of youth work, anyone who gets close to youth is vetted usually in some way. That's interesting. You know, I think about, you know, do you want someone who isn't charged with embezzlement to be your treasurer? And no, obviously not. But in my experience, boards don't usually do that. Doesn't mean they couldn't, doesn't mean they shouldn't, but they don't often do that. I'm going to wrap this up, and then we'll get to lots of questions about anything that we've talked about. So this committee hopefully says, okay, here's our short list of people who we think are going to fill our seats. We needed 3, hey, we have 4, or we needed 3, we only have 2, but we think that that's okay. We think that we'll be able to make it up next year, something like that. They bring the candidates to the board and vote. Sometimes you're going to be bringing people forward who are nominated, but sorry, let me rephrase that. Some people will have been nominated who you're not bringing forward. And if a board member nominated them, so, hey, what about this person? The committee chair might have to explain why they didn't do that. Usually it's best to just say, we really liked these candidates that we had. They really bring, it's really about them. It's not about that person. And you might be able to offer some of those other people committee spots, or just say, we really think that this person would be great next year. We want to get to know them a little bit better this year, something like that. I just want to flag that sometimes a board member can feel like, hey, I nominated someone and why aren't you bringing them forward? Most of the time it's fine. At that point, you vote, you bring them onto the board, or you approve them at the board meeting, and then at the next time before they would join the board, I really think it is worth having an orientation. I just alluded to this. The board president, let's say, the executive director, and the new board members, and just say, here's our history. Here's how we work. Here are acronyms that we tend to use. I mean, not everyone, I don't know if anyone here works with ACEs, adult adverse childhood experiences, but if you're talking about ACEs in your boardrooms, in your board meetings, it's nice to tell people in advance what some of these acronyms and shorthands mean. Here's our budget. Here's how it works. Here's just an introduction. And it's really nice to do it before you throw them into the deep end of the pool. I also think that it's nice to do it where you have this orientation, let's say 4 o'clock. And then when that orientation is done, you go into a board social and everyone's there and you get to introduce the new board members, and maybe you say farewell to some of the retiring board members. And it's just a nice social experience. And that's so helpful when the first meeting actually arrives, that those 3 new board members feel like they know people. And they feel like their first meeting wasn't just over a boardroom table, it was relational. It's a really nice habit to get into if you can. This is kind of mapping out how that might work. And again, someone might look at this and say, I can't believe that you're starting in July for a January start or something like that. But it doesn't actually take that much at the beginning. In July, who is doing this? You identify the committee. They meet in August, they meet in September. If you can combine those into one meeting, those first 2, maybe it's just September. October, that's when you do all of your outreach, your posting, hey, we're looking for board members. Come together in November, you evaluate, you recommend to the board, and then you do that orientation and social. If your fiscal year or when you bring on board members is aligned differently, you could move this back and forth, or whatever works for the calendar. I think a really good nominations process is probably recruiting and nominations process. It takes about 4 months. This is 6 months. And again, you're not doing a lot in some of those early months. It just spreads it out a little bit, but it prevents you from hurrying. It prevents you from rushing, prevents you from scrambling and like, oh, we just need any warm body. A little bit of forethought, and you can end up with great board members and probably a couple people who you're like, let's come back to them next year, which will make next year even easier. And with that, we can turn to some Q&A. I actually will stop sharing my screen if I can figure out, there's my mouse. And we might be able to see each other again. So, yeah.
Okay, there was a follow-up question to, does the board usually do a background check? And that question was, what if there's an issue with the background? How do you handle that?
I'm so intrigued by whether this is based on a real issue. So
whoever
asked this question, if you'd like to email me specifically, my email is eric@forsmallnonprofits.com. If you want to just email me confidentially. I really tend to think, I don't know what kind of issue disqualifies from board service necessarily. Someone who embezzled, you don't want to be treasured. Do you want that person to like never be on your board? I can see it going both ways, especially depending on how they talk about that. I would never do it again. I learned, paid my debt to society. I learned my lesson. There are certain things that might be disqualifying based on the work that you do. If you work with children and you had someone who abused a minor, that might be disqualifying right there, of course. So there's certain things, but if it's just like, this person had a DUI and it doesn't affect their job and it doesn't do this and it was 20 years ago, So I guess that would be my comment is sometimes you want to think about the context more than just the actual thing.
Okay, now the next question. Oh, I'm sorry. Who was that?
I also had a follow-up question to that too.
Oh, good.
A lot of our agencies have board members who are also tutors. And we recommend, or we encourage agencies to do background checks on all tutors, even if they're not working with kids, they're still working with vulnerable populations. So, and we know that if we do background checks on some tutors, we need to do it on all of them. So how do you, like, what would you recommend for having board members who are also tutors? Like, how do you delineate that?
Yeah. If there are, I'll address the first part, which if there are a policy that, you know, everyone should be background checked, then, and that's all tutors, let's say, then I can't, you know, then maybe background check everyone. Like I can see that, and that could easily apply to the board. Sometimes board members are also volunteers of the organization. When I was the director of the Grand Cinema, the people who were on my board, who I worked for, would sometimes also volunteer in the movie theater, taking tickets, selling popcorn, what have you. And we were clear that about that hourglass. Sometimes you are at this level of the organization, and sometimes you are taking direction from your director. Sometimes it's a hat thing. I mean, I really think, just talking about, you know, the different hats. Sometimes you're wearing a board member hat, and sometimes you're wearing a volunteer hat. It would be, it's most of the time it's not an issue, but you know, you wouldn't want to have a director feel like they couldn't give feedback to a board member, to a volunteer, excuse me, about, hey, here's some of the ways that we could improve this tutoring. You wouldn't want them to feel like they couldn't do it because they were also a board member. So it's really just about clarity. A board president, I really think, is the one who can say, let's remember, everyone, if you're volunteering in the organization, in those situations, our director is your boss, essentially. And other times it's, you know, it's a different situation, but let's try to keep these things clear. That would be my recommendation, is just clarity in advance. It's great that they want to help, but they shouldn't be trying to do their board member job from this other role too.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Couple more questions.
Okay.
One is, well, we'll make sure we get your email address in the chat. We need to do that. And then what are your thoughts? And I love this because this has been on boards that I've worked on. Give, get, or get off the board. How do you feel about that?
Give, get, or get off the board. In general, not even in general, I just don't like it. I will say that. And it is, it is get. That's the part that I don't like. Give is totally appropriate. I think a board should have 100% board giving. 100% of board members should give. There are, you know, some exceptions to it. If you have someone who, you know, the homeless shelter may not, who gets someone who has previously experienced homelessness, may not ask them to be, you know, a regular donor right away. But there's ways to where someone might give in their name or something like that. I believe that anyone on a board should be willing to give. I believe that, and 100% board giving should be the goal. I think about that gift in a couple ways. I think someone who's on the board should give a gift that is significant to them. There's a lot of different, you know, ways that could be. That could be that they should be in the top 3 gifts that you make in a year. That might mean it's a $100 gift. That might mean it's a $40 gift. That might mean it's a $5,000 gift. You know, it goes all ways. I don't think you should look to the person who can honestly tell you my $100 gift is a significant gift to me and say, you need to go get another 1,900 because we expect 2,000 from out of every board member. That's where I have a problem with it. That person doesn't have the training. That person doesn't have likely have the connections. I mean, you know, if they can give $100, they likely don't know where to go get the 1,900 from, the people who could give that. I'm making up numbers, but I hope that this is still clear. Every board member should be asked to give something that is significant to them, in my view. And they can support fundraising through, as I said, you know, stuffing envelopes, bringing people to the events, all of those things. But if you start putting these levels on, like we need to get to this much per board member or something like that, it's harder to hit. It's harder to get a more diverse board. It's harder to get younger board members who maybe, again, don't have those relationships that they need. I get that, you know, the Metropolitan Opera, is that the one that, you know, the big fundraising boards in New York or whatever, where like that's all they do, and there's 50 board members and they all bring in tens of thousands of dollars each, hundreds of thousands of dollars each. That is their thing. I don't think it's a model that's as effective for small nonprofits.
Great. The other question, and I know we're right at time, is it recommended to work with local business and maybe aspiring leaders who might want to build resume experience as they grow in roles? Thinking about asking to present at a workplace leaders meeting or like Rotary and make a pitch for that. Does that make sense?
I think getting in front of a group like Rotary, Kiwanis Clubs, Lions, any of those is great. That's always worth doing. I don't know that I would go in saying, you know, we're looking for board members, or we're looking for like I think it's like a, here's who we are, here's some ways to get involved if this resonates with you, with a couple different ways. Tutors, support, you know, sponsoring, you know, for your business to sponsor it, you know, board members, some of those things. Mentioning those things is great. Board members, or young people, or people who want to get more involved in the community, people who want to find new connections for their business, they all have reason to get involved in a nonprofit. And as long as they also love the mission and support it in that way, I wouldn't turn it down at all. I think that's a great idea.
Okay.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that's it for the questions, right, Marcia?
I don't see anything else except some thank yous, and oh my gosh, this was wonderful.
All right,
Oh,
great.
good.
And I will add to that too. Thank you, Eric, for a very informative and very useful session. And thank you to everyone who attended the session today. This was the Little Book of Boards, a conversation with Erik Hanberg, sponsored by Wisconsin Literacy. The next session for our virtual winter conference is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And it is a nice follow-up to this session. It's strategic planning, why and how you should pursue it for your organization. If you'd like to register or haven't registered for it yet, the link will be in the chat. And also, please, if you enjoyed this session, join us for the big share, which will be on Tuesday, March 7th, which is a fun day of virtual events and online giving that allows Wisconsin Literacy to offer this type of programming. Please watch your email for a survey link for this session. We appreciate any and all of your feedback and hope to see some of you tomorrow morning. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.